Thank you very much for the invitation. Diversity is an issue which represents itself to us in very many different ways in the City of Toronto, but I can tell you that I sit in a lot of agency boards and commissions as a City Councillor, and I was around a table this morning as a set of decisions were being made, and at that table there was this range of diversity. There were people from both sides of the Atlantic, from either side of the equator, families that come from either side of the equator, people whose families come from either side of the Pacific Ocean. There were people whose past included speaking Catharati, speaking Italian, people whose families arrived by boat as immigrants, as refugees, people who jumped the boat and decided to stay. There were people who had come by airplane. There were people who were Catholic, people who were going off, had kids going off to Catholic school and some going off to public school. There was as well a range of people who would speak Hindi, who had come out of Africa, who had come from the Mediterranean, who had come from the South Pacific. The table I just described as my breakfast table this morning. That's my family. Diversity is something which you can choose to embrace, but eventually in this city, diversity is something that will embrace you before it goes to bed or before it goes off to school. This is the city that we live in now. We come from distinct backgrounds, and we can talk about grandparents who left South Africa because of apartheid. We can talk about grandparents who came to Canada for opportunity or were forced out of their homelands many years ago for this, that, the other reason. But at the end of the day, diversity is what you encounter around virtually any table you break bread in this city. The challenge at the City of Toronto is to make that diversity show up around our boardroom tables and around our council table, around the clerk's table. And we've been taking a lot of steps at the city that I'm very proud of. Most importantly in the Civic Appointments Committee that I currently chair, that Janet Davis, a councillor, chaired at the start of this council, where we were very focused on trying to change the way in which we appointed to the hundreds of agency boards and commissions, everything from the Zoo Board to the Library Board, to the Police Service Board, to the Toronto Port Authority, right down to the Committee of Adjustment, to the Rooming House Bylaw, Tribunal, the whole gambit of city boards, agency boards and commissions. We understood that we had to make sure that when people came in from this diverse city to get a ruling or to present an idea or to get a job or to do whatever they wanted to do with the city, that the board that they sat in front of should look like the subway car they had arrived on. It should look like the classroom that the kids were going to in the morning time. It looked like the streets of Toronto. It was the face and the sound and the experience of growing up and living in the city. And so the first thing we did was we started to track it very heavily in the last term of council to make sure that we understood where we're at, and then to measure that against the demographics of the city to find out where we needed to get to. And we looked at the various deficiencies, and we started a series of very comprehensive targeted ad campaigns to make sure that our recruitment policies gave us a pool of applicants that was as reflective as possible of the makeup of the city. The additional challenge that we also have geographic constraints upon us, or geographic challenges in front of us. We need to make sure that Scarborough and North York and Etobicoke and the downtown are all represented, as well as not just the different ethnic cultural groups, as well as people with disabilities, as well as the lesbian, gay, and transgender communities, all the different diversities that are measured when you start talking about diversity, because it's not simply where you're from, it's also where you are and where you might be going as well, that they're critical to the success of the city. And I'm proud, and the book captures it in better statistical detail than I recall necessarily from time to time, and my family being Australian, we do tend to embellish, so bear with me. But our appointment record is actually, I think, something that the city is, and is represent your interests on that city council, amongst others, something we all can be very, very proud of. In terms of gender, 50% of our appointments are women this time around. In terms of the growth in targeted groups, that 41% jump to the point we're now in the mid-30s in terms of representing different ethno-cultural groups. Where we've had challenges are in Scarborough. The community media on the ground is not quite as complex as some other parts of the city. We've had to redouble our efforts to find out how that neighborhood talks to itself to make sure that we get our messages out there. But we've also had challenges in particular communities, the Aboriginal community, for example, and young people. We had one very interesting round of approvals, a round of appointments around the Toronto Conservation Authority. And for the first time, a whole slew of young people with environmental science degrees and conservation degrees are coming out of the universities and presenting themselves as candidates. What they lacked was critical board experience. When you asked them about conflict of interest, they didn't quite know what you're talking about. When you talked about procedures and boards that sat on, they didn't have that background. And that's where the Maytree Foundation and other agencies are starting to embed those those practices as experiences in people's curriculum or their resumes, so that we can now take advantage of the other skills they bring to the table that aren't necessarily easily represented inside an interview process. That's been one part of it. The other thing I think we're starting to see as well is a couple of other critical changes that have emerged. One of them, I think, is in the Police Service Board, which I also sit on, and my colleague Helen Grange, being there before I was instrumental in trying to get this set up. Deputy Chief Keith Ford has led an extraordinary recruitment and the diversity program inside the City of Toronto. The last couple of hires that I've witnessed being signed on to the police, 140 candidates, well over 80 with a second, if not a third language. This is a police force which is changing itself from within after years of difficult struggles in the city and doesn't get the pat on the back that perhaps it deserves. What that means when a call goes out, the officer that arrives, if they don't have the language skills required, they know someone in the force who does. And that call and the radio call goes out, and the reinforcement and the support to make sure that the policing is done as sensitively and as creatively and as smartly as possible happens. And what's been really interesting about the drive to make sure that the new classes reflect the city and all its diversity is that what's actually also accompanied this drive for diversity is that of the 140 that applied, and we've got close to 50 in terms of racialized minorities as well as women. 50% of the hiring class met those targeted groups. But what's also happened is we try harder and harder to reach those targets. The education level of the police force is risen with it. 1 and 2 degrees is not uncommon amongst the new recruits into the policing department now. And what diversity has brought to the police department is not just that rich experience and that rich set of skills to deal with people on a human-to-human basis, but it's also brought with it extraordinary amounts of education and backgrounds that are much more diverse than you'd expect just simply by looking at someone's easy identifiers on it through an interview process. And that's leading to better policing in a whole series of ways as well. I'd like to quickly end on one other quick example and a quick little anecdote I know you're standing and trying to wrap up. But a microphone between a politician and food, and you can guarantee a hungry audience. But it's Toronto Community Housing is another excellent example where we've not just dealt with diversity in terms of how it represents itself genetically, but the current chair of the TCHC is a former tenant. And when you go through the process of redevelopment or dealing with tenant complaints or the backlog of repairs or the struggle to try and make life better for the people who live in that community, when they know that they're dealing with the chair of the body who's actually a former tenant, it raises their spirits in terms of what they think they can present to the board as evidence, what they think they get as a fair hearing, and the argument that happens as they try to change and shape policy. And it's a profound difference in terms of the tone of the debate, the quality of the debate, the depth of the understanding as policy has evolved, and it allows communities that think they're on the outside to suddenly see themselves on the inside. And that changes the whole tenor of debate. I can tell you that Regent Park, with all its troubles, compared to Alexander Park, which is the neighborhood in my ward, which is up for redevelopment, is night and day. They start to see TCHC as an ally in the fight for better housing, not simply as the provider of housing. And what also starts to happen is that young people start to come to the fore and start to realize that there's a trajectory here that they're part of, that they can tie into, that's part of their life experience. And in Alexander Park, the redevelopment exercise is being led by a young 20-year-old who's a planning student at Ryerson, who's a resident of community housing. And as she goes about doing her work on that particular project, the co-op board at Alexander House is being taken over by 20-year-olds. Most of them parents came to this country as immigrants, if not themselves, and they too are now sitting down across the table from Mr. Mitchell, who's the chair, and they're working out a better future for themselves. And that's the same sort of diversity that you see around that table that you see in my morning, when I have my morning coffee, and I hope that the conversation is as embracing and as total and as emotional and as strict at times, but as full of possibilities as what I've described to you. And just one last point, because it's something which I think is really critical as we start looking towards the next election. It's the hardest group to change at times is the group of politicians, and I'm glad that you're hard at work at it because I don't want to do this job forever. but I think that it's difficult to change that body politic very quickly because it's just beyond the control of everyone who thinks they have a great idea. Politics is a difficult place to get anybody elected, let alone a targeted group or a group that's underrepresented. We have a mayoralty race that's currently unfolding. And one of them, I'm not trying to endorse anybody, but it speaks to something in the city which is just below the surface of what we're talking about tonight. One of the candidates is Glenn Murray. And he's often talked of in very dismissive ways as coming from Winnipeg. Who does he think he is to suggest himself as a mayor of a big city when he comes from Winnipeg? And it's a very interesting comment because there's probably only one city in the world where a mayor from somewhere else might get a fair shot at becoming the mayor of another city, and that's Toronto. But when we say he's not from here, that resonates in people's lives in ways that is without doubt damaging. When someone like Glenn Murray is from away and isn't qualified, or even Michael Ignatieff with a Harvard degree and an Oxford degree and taught at Harvard, he's not qualified to lead. That speaks to foreign trained professionals. That talks to migrants in this city or immigrants in this city, people from away, in a way that we're not necessarily conscious about. And that's got to change. When somebody from Winnipeg says they want to help, the door ought to be open. Just as it ought to be open if somebody from Port of Spain says they want to help, or somebody from Sao Paulo wants to help, or somebody from Sydney, Australia wants to help. And when that door is closed politically, and when that door is closed culturally, when the media is part of the group that's leading that closing of the door, the problems that we have to tackle with reports like this and events like tonight, the work is very much in front of us, not behind us. And before we get too comfortable, I want you to leave with that thought and just think that that's the work that lies ahead.